A resident historian, History Miami, with another Miami history story for you. We began this series at the beginning of last week, so now we're into our seventh historical discussion. And today we're treating a topic that is so broad, so interesting, so variegated that I have hopes of completing what I want to talk about today, but I'm not sure we're going to get through everything. There's so much to it. And that is World War II and Greater Miami. Questions have come up about readings for different topics, and I would recommend for this the general histories I mentioned yesterday, that is Miami, USA, and Miami the Magic City. Also, a book I wrote on Jesu, the Catholic Church in downtown Miami. I've got a section there in World War II because Jesu is right in the middle of so much that was going on in terms of men and women in uniform at that time. Evelyn Mayerson wrote a tremendous book called No Enemy But Time, which was Miami Beach in World War II. And I thought that was really a great study, because there were hundreds of thousands of men and women that took training on the beach as part of the Army Air Force. Also, I'd recommend a tremendous article by Gary Mormino. We published it in the 1997 issue of Tequesta called Midas Returns to Miami. That is, good times returned, certainly in terms of finances for the city. There's the Agnew Welch scrapbooks, which I've leaned on heavily for a lot of my research over the years and decades. He was a Miami News librarian, sometime writer, and he put together a whole series of clippings in different books, and they're in the vault of the Downtown Library's Florida room. And it's just really a gold mine of information on that era and on, as well as on other eras too, but especially World War II. So there's been a lot of stuff written on it, and I'd recommend all of these particular sources I mentioned to you. So where do we begin? We begin, of course, with the tremendous optimism on the part of hotel owners and restaurateurs and nightclub operators in December of 1941. We're out of the Great Depression. There is a war raging in Europe. There's a war in the Orient. But we're far away from all of this, at least at that point, and they're looking forward to their best season ever on Miami Beach, as well as downtown Miami, the season of 1941-42. And then, of course, word comes of the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. It's interesting to note, and I just wanted to stray about 25 miles north of here to mention a couple things about the beginning of the war, and in this case, Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale was a small town at that time. U.S. Census in 1940 counted just 17,000 plus people. And it was a Sunday, Pearl Harbor Day. We got news of the attack after 1 p.m. that day. You can hear my birds in the background. I covered them, but they're very, very loquacious today. And so at the major intersection of Fort Lauderdale at that time, in downtown Fort Lauderdale, was Andrews Avenue and Southwest 2nd Street. And that's where City Hall was. And as part of City Hall, there was the police department. And also there was a bus stop there where one of the bus lines would begin its pilgrimage through parts of Fort Lauderdale at that stop. And so the bus driver was sitting there. He looked up to the second floor where the police department was in Fort Lauderdale. And he yelled to a police friend of his while he was waiting to crank up his bus on, "Anything going on today?" And the police said, "Oh, no, nothing much going on. It's another quiet Sunday. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and other than that, nothing much is happening," just kind of nonchalantly. But it was also Fort Lauderdale who had the first Congressional Medal of Honor winner, a man named Sandy Nininger, who grew up there, went to West Point, and was awarded the medal posthumously for holding off a dozen Japanese, protecting some of his men in the Philippines in the early part of 1942. First award winner. Miami. Miami was a center of the war effort, as well as an area that felt the effects of fighting in terms of active German submarines or U-boats off of our coastline early on in the war. Something else I think is kind of poignant about Miami, when news erupted in Miami about Pearl Harbor, of course it was a much bigger city. Miami at that time had about 173,000 plus people, the city. County, over 200,000. So there was a lot of brouhaha about it. But something happened that was kind of subtle and quiet. There was a generational Japanese family that had some kind of a restaurant on or along or near the Miami River. And the younger generation who was helping that is, a son was helping his father at the restaurant, he quietly left his home with word of Pearl Harbor, apparently went down to the eatery and put a sign on the door, closed. And obviously it was closed for the duration and more of the war itself. Meantime, the next day, you begin to see people flocking to the draft ward to sign up. You find a local defense council that's organized to protect the city, fear an invasion. And so there's a lot of things going on early on in Miami at that time. Miami Herald, in fact, on Pearl Harbor Day, this was Sunday once again, issued a special edition. And one of the newsmen, a man named C.A. Delancey, sold 800 copies of that in 2 hours, which was considered an awful lot for that time. As historian Gary Mormino has noted in his article that I mentioned before in Tequesta, he said, and I quote, "Wartime Miami resembled a combination of Casablanca and Grand Central Terminal." And he was talking about it from the early days on in that manner. Nixon Smiley was a very savvy Miami Herald columnist, wrote a lot of Florida and local history columns. He noted that at the war's beginnings, Miami still had many of the qualities of a small town. As you walk down Miami Avenue or Flagler Street, those are the two main streets of Miami, downtown, you met person after person you called by their first name. The war changed all that, end quote. I think one of the first things that jumps out at you when you assess Miami in World War II and what our role was and how it impacted us would be as a giant training center. The Army and Navy, wasn't an Air Force at that time, a separate branch, no. Attracted by the area's flat terrain, broad waters, and mild weather, established large training bases here. Miami Beach became an important center for members of the Army Air Force, with hundreds of thousands of men and women taking training there. And they did it in hundreds of Art Deco-style hotels and apartments across the southern part of the island. That is up to probably what today you would call mid-beach. There wasn't much development, say, beyond 40th Street on Miami Beach at that time. One reporter noted about the hotels, which were rapidly converted beginning in January of 1942 into housing for men and women in uniform. He wrote, and I quote, "The hotels made good barracks. The baby pink and eggshell furniture is stored now. 3-decker Army bunks jam the pastel tinted rooms, dance floors, nightclubs," end quote. Briefly, in the summer of 1942, there was a hotel in Miami Beach, the Cadet Hotel at James Avenue and 17th Street, that housed, among other enlistees, Matinee Isle Clark Gable, who was an Army Air Force enlistee. And it's interesting because it was there that Clark Gable had his celebrated mustache shaved off for the cause, as the expression went, and accepted a new salary scale of $66 a month. A wiseacre posted a sign in the lobby of the hotel that said, quote, "Clark Gable swept here," end quote. Now, one of the things that always jumps out at us when we look at the beach in World War II was the fact that you had the so-called 90-day wonders. They were here, they trained, they took basic training, oftentimes shirtless, on Miami Beach, on the sand, just before the water. So there's really no question, I don't think in my mind, why the population of Greater Miami and South Florida really soared after the end of World War II, because a lot of these folks came from the Northeast, where it was cold, obviously, in January or December or March. And here they were down here in the subtropical Eden. In fact, Damon Runyon, that mischievous writer of short stories and books, he wrote on one occasion that these soldiers got, quote, sand in their shoes in that subtropical ambiance of South Florida, end quote, and returned in a big way after the war. And then other training bases, training facilities that dotted the area, Greater Miami, included an area right next to the Port of Miami, which became the Special Preserve of the Navy, which operated there, a U.S. subchaser school, sometimes referred to as a Donald Duck Navy because they operated in small boats. And that subchaser school stood a little bit north of 8th Street on Biscayne Boulevard, or I should say on the bay shore itself. Hundreds of men came through there for training. And among the people that trained there was Peter Salinger, who was John Kennedy's press secretary when John Kennedy was president, but also John Kennedy came through there during the course of the war. Nearby, the Navy trained men just south of there to operate PT boats, while Bayfront Park was a recreational field, which for a while even featured prostitution. In fact, the Navy was so enraged about all that first of all, they trimmed back the hedges that actually separated a view of the park from the walkway, the sidewalk on Biscayne Boulevard. And eventually, because that didn't help very much, they just cut down all the bushes, period. And it became a huge recreational field for the Navy. In fact, that's when they began to build incrementally what became the Bayfront Park Auditorium, used for many years and decades after that for a variety of purposes. Many of the sailors who exercised, operated boats, engaged in recreation in Bayfront Park lived across the street in such hotels, and these were mid-20s boom era hotels as the Alcazar and the Everglades and other nearby hotels, but also the McAllister Hotel at the corner of East Flagler and Biscayne Boulevard became a large mess hall for these men in uniform. Among the naval personnel along the Bayfront were, in addition to American naval personnel, were members of the Chinese and Soviet navies, both of whom were allied with us in World War II. Another major facility was Pan American Field, also known as the 36th Street Airport, out of which has emerged today's Miami International Airport. It was converted into something called the Miami Air Depot headquarters, a huge military aviation facility for thousands of soldiers. Nearby was the Army Air Force Air Transport Command. They established a base there. And this was a vastly important both cargo and passenger operation. Command airplanes delivered passengers and cargoes to the Southern Hemisphere, as well as anti-tank ammunition to hard-pressed British forces in North Africa in the early years of our involvement in the war. South Dade County, in that area, the federal government cleared the piney woods around today's Zoo Miami and erected the Richmond Naval Air Station to house giant lighter-than-air blimps patrolling the nearby waters of the Gulf Stream and the Atlantic, looking for German U-boats or submarines. They built 3 hangars. Those hangars were 16 stories in height. They comprised a complex that represented the largest aircraft shelters in the world. As the story goes, they were so tall that rain clouds formed inside of them. And there was good reason, as I mentioned before, for their presence, because German U-boats were active in the waters, especially in the early years of the war. In fact, off the coast of South Florida, between our beginning of our involvement in the war in 1942 and mid-1943, about 24 ships were sunk by U-boats. And I think the one that hit closest at home for us was a sinking of a Mexican oil tanker in May of 1942 in the early going of the war, the Puerto de Lavo, in the nearby waters of the Atlantic Ocean. It let off a black plume as it kind of crawled north along the coastline that you could see from a great distance. I had a visitor to my office when I was teaching at Miami-Dade about 10 or 15 years ago. He was a retired attorney. He was living over by 25th Road, close to the bay, as a young boy at the time, when that ship was hit by a German U-boat. And he remembered he was asleep, and all of a sudden this tremendous flash just entered the room, and it awakened him. And he looked up, and it looked like a ball of fire in the distance. So really vivid memory of that particular incident. There was a naval air station at Opelika. There was an air base in Homestead, out of which would grow eventually the Homestead Air Force Base, a SAC base in the Cold War. The Navy converted the picturesque Pan American Airways terminal, which was completed in 1934 at Dinner Key, into an air station. And that, of course, had been a naval air station in World War I. And there were a lot of ancillary businesses in Miami that contributed to the war effort. One was the Miami Shipbuilding Company, which stood about where that American Social Club is now, on the south bank of the Miami River, just east of the Southwest 2nd Avenue Bridge. It was the Miami Shipbuilding Company, and they were creating PT, or patrol torpedo boats, as well as aircraft rescue vessels. A tremendous amount of activity in that boatyard. They also did repair work on John Kennedy's PT-109, which later, of course, saw action, a very diverse action, in fact, in the Pacific. There was Merrill Stevens, where it is today, just west of the 12th Avenue Bridge. It converted hundreds of pleasure craft into a fleet of naval support vessels. There was a huge call on the part of the government for assistance of that kind. And many of those boats, in fact, were weaponized. It won the E Award from the federal government for its excellence in war-related work. There was Day Dry Dock, also founded by the principals in the company of Merrill Stevens. Merrill Stevens had been on the river since 1923. The company itself began in Jacksonville in 1883, so it's a very venerable Florida business, today owned, incidentally, by a Turkish billionaire. And Day Dry Dock, run by Alex Balfe, who was a principal in the Merrill Stevens operation, was a full-service facility that was located by the Port of Miami, which at that time was where Maurice Ferré Park is today, on the bayfront. And it engaged in new construction as well as full-service activities on boats. And then there was the civilian service, that is, service to the war cause on the part of civilians in the greater Miami area. There was a civilian air patrol. For example, if you were someone who wandered by today's St. Peter and Paul Roman Catholic Church and you looked up at a tower in 1942 and 1943, you might have seen a volunteer there looking for enemy airplanes that might be coming over the area. Fortunately, we were spared that. Or there were also patriotic parades, about 161 parades on Saturdays beginning at the outset of the war, essentially January of 1942, all the way into the latter stages of the war in mid-1945. The parades began at the courthouse in downtown Miami and extended east into Bayfront Park. And they were held to raise patriotic fervor, to sell war bonds. In fact, Miamians really helped out in terms of helping to finance the war. We bought, or our predecessors bought, more than $300 million in war bonds. The parades were there to announce that. Oftentimes military vehicles were used as part of the parade. Miamians also invited soldiers into their homes for holidays and faithfully complied with brownouts and blackouts and rationing and shortage of meat and other consumer items. We had scrap metal drives. There was one near the Florida East Coast Railway railroad tracks just west of the courthouse, in fact. And then in terms of individuals, I thought it was always kind of interesting to see what Mitchell Wolfson did. He was already a great theater magnate at that time. He was also the first Jewish mayor of Miami Beach, and he resigned office in 1943. We have a copy of a letter that he wrote to his sister, and he said he's leaving office to, and this is just kind of distilling what he said, quote, fight the Nazis, end quote. And he did see service in Germany. In 1942, in terms of individuals, an enterprise in Miamian built the city's first air raid shelter in the Little River neighborhood. That would be part of today's Little Haiti. And it was a bomb-proof fortress with space for 150 neighbors. Of course, that begs the question, what happens to everybody else if there's an attack by air? There were also some interesting African-American gains in World War II, even though Jim Crow was about as rigid as it had been since the late 19th century. For example, the first black patrolmen, policemen hired to patrol only what was then called Colored Town and other black communities, joined the Police Force 5 in 1944. Those numbers increased within a year to 15. There was equalization of teacher salaries. We can thank the NAACP and other organizations for pushing for that. Prior to that time, African American teachers earned about half what Caucasian teachers earned in public schools in the state of Florida. There was also creation of a long sought after black beach. We all know it today as Virginia Key Beach, and that became a reality in the early summer of 1945. Women in the war effort. Well, many in fact were obviously in the armed forces, but others did war work, and they flocked to war effort in large ways. For example, many filled positions as clerks, as statisticians, as milkmaids. They delivered milk. As hotel elevator operators. Some were engaged in factory work. We had a very small factory system in Miami and in Dade County on the eve of the war itself. And there was SPARS, an acronym for Women's Reserve of the U.S. Coast Guard, or WAVES, Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service. We had USOs headed by women, and they were ubiquitous. You could find USOs almost everywhere. On Miami Beach, in fact, I had a beloved aunt who met her husband at a USO on South Beach at a dance back in 1942 or 43. Probably among the most important of the women involved in a local cause, or the local cause during the war, was none other than the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who came to the Miami area, visited Miami Beach, had a hospital that had been shuttered, reopened as a naval hospital, also visited what was then called Color Town, the black community. She visited the Biltmore Hotel, which was now Pratt Army Air Force Hospital. And there, in fact, one night, they would show movies every Saturday night. One night she showed up unannounced and joined the very wounded servicemen. Many were wheeled in bed to see these movies, joined them for a movie. So she was an interesting force when it came to the Miami area. Someone else I wanted to mention in terms of a local connection to the war, and I mean a huge local connection, would be Paul Tibbets Jr., who piloted the Enola Gay, named for his mother. And his parents were living in Miami at the time he took the Enola Gay over Hiroshima and dropped the first atomic bomb. It was August 6, 1945. But what a lot of people don't know is they know about the second flight 3 days later over Nagasaki, and that was boxcar with the bomb Fat Man aboard. The co-pilot was Lieutenant Charles Albury, who had lived at one point where the downtown Miami Police Department station is right now. And then there was, of course, the POW camps. There was one in Homestead. There was one where the Bal Harbor shops are today. And probably the most notable of those was one just across the street from the entrance to Dayland. That was a Piney Woods area. And those men had been picked up in the North African campaign, had been captured then. And they lived in barracks that were built, again, across from the Dayland Mall, which didn't open until 1962. They lived in barracks that were built by the Civilian Conservation Corps beginning in 1935. And it's interesting to note that some of the POWs, the German POWs, came back to the area in the 1970s just to take a look at where they had been incarcerated a long time before that. And then finally, of course, we come to VJ Day. And VJ Day, of course, was a source of tremendous celebration. President Truman, upon hearing of the Japanese surrender, went over to the White House study, sat in front of a radio mic and announced in the early evening of August 14, 1945, that the Japanese had surrendered. And there was just instant bedlam throughout the country. About 30,000 people abruptly descended on downtown Miami. According to historian Gary Mormino, quote, VJ Day marked the greatest single concentration of joy ever witnessed in Miami history. And the celebration, of course, went into the night. Ground zero for it was the intersection of Southeast Northeast 2nd Avenue and Flagler Street in front of the Olympia Theater. And the bedlam just went on. But it's interesting to note that that celebration was amazing. The war itself, the war to end all wars, as far as I'm concerned, was over. But we quickly turned to peacetime pursuits, like spending on consumer goods, like building new subdivisions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So having thrown all that at you, I'll entertain any questions anybody might have. Karen McCammon tells us that graduates from Coral Gables with Charles Albury's son, Skip Albury, who I believe was an athlete too. That's a great connection. I had no idea. Ken Wild tells us that 2 German POWs escaped from the Kendall camp in 1944, made their way to Hialeah and surrendered there, and that's indeed exactly what happened as far as I know it. Julia Gautier-Tatel, my mom volunteered with the Red Cross at the Biltmore Hotel. Lots of Red Cross volunteers among the women and even some of the men of this community. Ken Wild, in 1943, U.S. Navy barges were being built and launched at West 9th Street and Okeechobee Road next to the water plant in Hialeah. Thanks, Ken, and there's more here. Again, just to share this with you, he mentions 14 barges would be built for use in World War II in an assembly line process. And then they were launched into the Miami Canal. It's great stuff, thank you. Steve Richards used to camp as a Boy Scout out at the air base. Pure torture. Okay, just looking here. Courtney Mills just ordered No Enemy But Time on Amazon. I was going to mention to you just in a sort of a personal way. I was working with a longtime friend of mine. He brought me back to Miami on a novel, historical novel on Miami, and I was going to take its whole history up to the present. And I got into those archives of the Agnew scrapbooks. And I can remember I was in the downtown library. At that time, I was in Bayfront Park, and he was out in L.A., and I would call him. I'd say, you just can't believe what I'm just reading. And we'd just share that with him. This was pre-cell phone. This is the early 1980s. But it was really quite a topic. I'm just looking through here, see if there's any more questions. A lot of nice people are watching. And we're delighted to have you all with us. And History Miami is providing these things because we feel like it's really important to share our history. And at a time like this, we can reach people in this social media platform. We look forward to talking with you again tomorrow. Join us at History Miami. We'd love to have you as part of our membership if you already aren't. Got a lot of things up ahead of us once good times return to us. But thanks so much. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the Burdine family, their stores, and Miami. And it's kind of an interesting story. So I'll look forward to seeing you all. And thanks so much for tuning in. I appreciate so much. Take care and have a good day. Thank you.